The morning sunlight filtered through the trees lining the quiet streets of a South Side neighborhood. People bustled about, some chatting, others arranging their market stalls. Amid the lively atmosphere, Jake Miller, a veteran patrol officer, sat in his parked cruiser by the curb. His cold, detached eyes scanned the passers-by as though searching for something suspicious. Jake wasn't known for his warmth. His colleagues often described him as extremely strict, carrying biases he didn't even realize he had. Suddenly, an elderly black woman caught Jake's attention. She wore a worn-out coat and a frayed knit hat, carrying an oversized, bulging bag. Jake frowned. A thought nagged at him. Something's not right about her. Who carries a bag that big and wanders around at this hour? Jake immediately started his patrol car and slowly drove toward the woman. Parking nearby, he stepped out, his polished black boots hitting the pavement with a sharp thud. Approaching her, his cold voice rang out. "Hey, stop right there." The woman turned around, her kind eyes meeting Jake's, surprised but calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked gently. Jake scrutinized her from head to toe, missing no detail. "What's in the bag? Open it for me to check," he demanded, with no trace of courtesy. The woman frowned slightly but kept her voice steady. "It's just some groceries I bought at the market. Nothing unusual." Jake wasn't convinced, his icy stare unyielding. "Open the bag now. That's an order." The woman slowly set the bag on the ground and opened it. Inside were vegetables, some bread, and milk. Jake looked inside, but his suspicions lingered. She could be hiding something at the bottom, he thought. Without further justification, he yanked the bag from her hands and rummaged through it, scattering its contents without regard for her dignity. "You see, I've done nothing wrong," the woman said, her tone still calm but tinged with irritation. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he brusquely pushed past her, his shove too forceful, causing the woman to stumble and fall onto the sidewalk. The sound of her body hitting the ground startled nearby pedestrians, who began to gather, murmuring amongst themselves. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene. "What the hell are you doing?" a man shouted from the crowd. Jake turned sharply, barking, "Back off. This is police business." But the crowd didn't budge. Several people kept filming, their faces filled with anger. Jake felt the weight of their judgment but maintained his hard stance. To him, this was simply a reasonable suspicion in the name of protecting the community. The crowd grew larger by the minute. Some people stood silently watching, but many began voicing their outrage at Jake's actions. A young woman with her hair tied in a ponytail shouted, "He just pushed that elderly woman. We can't let this slide." A middle-aged man, standing closer, raised his phone to record and yelled, "Stop abusing your power. We're going to report you." Jake, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to maintain his composure. Pointing at the crowd, he declared, "I'll report every one of you for obstructing police work. Disperse now, or I'll start making arrests." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The crowd stood firm, some continuing to record while others shouted in protest. Meanwhile, the elderly woman had managed to get back on her feet, slowly brushing the dust off her coat. She said nothing, only fixing Jake with a gaze filled with profound disappointment, as though her eyes could pierce through to his very soul. Jake avoided her gaze, but the unsettling feeling lingered. For a brief moment, he felt as though her stare was a silent curse that would follow him forever. "I have nothing more to say to you," the woman said, her voice trembling but firm. "I just hope you won't live to regret what you've done today." Without a word, Jake turned and climbed back into his patrol car. He drove away, his face set in stone, but the murmurs of the crowd trailed behind him. Many in the crowd had recorded the entire incident, knowing full well this was far from the end of the story. That evening, Evelyn sat in her small home, staring at the screen of her old phone. A video of her was spreading like wildfire on social media. Angry comments and hashtags demanding justice filled the feed. She knew the story wouldn't die down anytime soon, but Evelyn didn't want to dwell on that. For her, the most important thing was to ensure this situation didn't impact her son, Thomas. Evelyn, who had endured a lifetime of prejudice, had always raised Thomas with the hope that he would stand against injustice, and she was proud that he had lived up to that hope. Thomas Carter, currently the city's chief of police, was known as a principled leader who tolerated no misconduct within his force. But few people, apart from a select few, knew that Evelyn was his biological mother. Evelyn quietly set the phone down. A part of her wanted to call Thomas immediately, but she knew he had likely already seen the video. Sooner or later, Thomas would come to her. Thomas Carter couldn't believe his eyes as he watched the video sent by a colleague. He recognized his mother instantly, the kind eyes, the calm demeanor, unmistakably hers. But what enraged him most was the way Jake Miller, one of the officers under his command, had treated her. Thomas clenched his fists, his face flushed with anger. He knew this wasn't just a simple personal mistake. It was a glaring example of the systemic racism he was fighting to change. Jake Miller, he has no idea what he's just done, Thomas muttered, his voice hoarse with fury. Without delay, Thomas called for an emergency meeting at the police department. He ordered an immediate internal investigation and suspended Jake pending the outcome. In the conference room, Thomas looked around at his colleagues, his voice cutting through the tension like ice. "We cannot allow behavior like this to persist in our force. I will personally see to it that this matter is handled." After the meeting, Thomas drove to his mother's house. He needed to hear her side of the story and ensure she was okay. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry this happened, but I promise you, justice will be served." At the police station the following morning, the atmosphere was tenser than ever. Everyone had seen the video circulating on social media and the backlash directed at Jake Miller. But the sudden appearance of Police Chief Thomas Carter in the briefing room heightened the tension even further. Thomas rarely called emergency meetings unless the matter was extremely serious. Jake sat quietly in the corner, feeling the heat like he was on trial. He tried to appear calm, but a relentless wave of anxiety gnawed at him. He knew everyone was staring at him, but he kept telling himself he had done nothing wrong. "Just a suspicious old lady," he muttered internally. Thomas entered the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Jake. He took his seat at the head of the table and spoke, his deep voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. "Jake Miller, I want you to recount the events of yesterday, every detail, from start to finish." Jake stood, struggling to keep his tone composed. He recounted the incident from his perspective, emphasizing that he was simply doing his job and acting on reasonable suspicion when he saw Mrs. Evelyn carrying a large bag in an area he deemed prone to petty crime. But Thomas didn't waver. As soon as Jake finished, Thomas opened his laptop and played the video everyone had already seen online. The room fell silent except for the clear audio of the clip. The footage showed Jake shoving Mrs. Evelyn, his cold demeanor, and her pained expression. The evidence was undeniable. When the video ended, Thomas closed the laptop and looked directly at Jake, his eyes filled with disappointment. "This is how you enforce the law? An elderly woman shoved to the ground because you found her suspicious? Is this how we protect our community?" Jake swallowed hard, unable to respond. A colleague spoke up hesitantly, his tone nervous. "Chief, maybe this was just a momentary lapse in judgment." "Jake didn't mean to," Thomas interrupted, his voice colder and sharper. "This was not a lapse. This was prejudice and abuse of power. I will not tolerate this in my force. Jake Miller, you are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately. An internal investigation will commence, and if necessary, I will see to it that this matter goes to court." The room was silent. Jake lowered his head, unable to utter another word. In his mind, one question repeated itself over and over. How did it come to this? Jake returned home in a state of turmoil. His small apartment was eerily quiet. But outside, the world was no longer the same. Messages began flooding in from friends and colleagues. Some supportive, some critical, but most simply keeping their distance. He checked his phone and saw his voicemail inbox full of threats and scathing messages from strangers. On social media, his name had become a lightning rod for outrage. A hashtag calling for his dismissal was trending, with thousands joining the chorus. Jake felt like the entire world was against him. For a moment, his mind drifted back to his childhood, growing up in a family steeped in prejudice. His parents often spoke about the differences between races, planting skewed ideas of white superiority in his young mind. Over the years, those biases became so ingrained that Jake hardly recognized them as part of who he was. I was just doing my job. How did I become the villain? Jake asked himself. But deep down, a faint sense of guilt began to stir, creeping into the edges of his thoughts. In another part of the city, Evelyn sat in her small kitchen, sipping a cup of hot tea. A knock at the door echoed through the room, and she knew exactly who it was. Thomas walked in, his face tired but his eyes resolute. He looked at his mother, unable to hide the concern etched across his features. "Are you okay, Mom?" Evelyn gave a gentle smile, setting her tea down on the table. "I'm fine, Thomas. You don't need to worry." But Thomas couldn't shake the unease inside him. He sat across from her, his hands clenched tightly on the table. "Mom, I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry for what happened. Jake is one of my officers, and I feel like I failed by letting this happen." Evelyn looked at her son, her gaze kind but full of depth. "Thomas, you don't need to apologize to me. I know you're a man of integrity. I just hope you'll ensure that actions like this don't continue within your force." Thomas nodded, but the weight of the situation still lingered. "Mom, why didn't you tell people that you're my mother? If they knew, it might have made everything easier." Evelyn shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "That's not necessary, Thomas. I don't want this to become about me and you. This is about injustice, about the change we need to see. I don't want to overshadow that." Thomas sat in silence, but inside him, a stronger determination than ever before began to take root. In the days that followed, the situation showed no signs of calming down. Protests erupted across the city, with banners demanding justice for Evelyn and calling for reforms within the police force. At the police department, Thomas faced pressure from all sides. Some members of the team were unhappy with how he handled Jake's case, accusing him of caving to public opinion. Others, particularly younger officers, supported him, seeing his actions as a necessary step toward rebuilding trust with the community. The media coverage was relentless. Every time Thomas appeared before the press, he emphasized that the police force must be held accountable for its wrongdoings. But he knew that words alone weren't enough. He needed action. Meanwhile, Jake lived in isolation. He had lost not just his job but also his dignity. Questions about right and wrong, justice, and prejudice began to take root in his mind, forcing him to confront the beliefs he had carried for so long. This story was no longer just about one man's mistake. It had become a symbol of the broader struggle against injustice and discrimination. But the question remained, could those involved on all sides change and rediscover who they truly were? On the stage of a large auditorium in the city center, a gentle light shone down on Evelyn as she stood before hundreds of people, both young and old. Below the stage, cameras from various news outlets were trained on her. This was a press conference organized by a civil rights organization, and Evelyn had been invited as a key witness to the recent, widely publicized incident. Though uneasy about speaking in front of such a large crowd, Evelyn maintained her composure. There was a calm strength in her eyes that overshadowed any fear. She took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice steady and deliberate, yet powerful. "That day, I was just an elderly woman going to the market to buy a few necessities. I did nothing wrong, posed no threat to anyone, and broke no laws. But I was treated like a criminal, simply because of the color of my skin. That is not right. The room fell silent. Her words, though simple, carried the weight of decades of injustice she and so many others had endured. I'm not standing here asking for pity. I'm standing here to demand change. This is not the first time something like this has happened. And if we do nothing, it will not be the last. Evelyn looked around the room, her eyes filled with quiet hope. I have lived through times when people couldn't sit at the same table just because of the color of their skin. I have seen things that seemed impossible to change. But we made it happen. And I believe, if we stand together and fight, we can change this too. Her speech ended to thunderous applause. Though weary, Evelyn felt a sense of relief. She knew that her words were not just a call for justice for herself, but a rallying cry for an entire community that had been oppressed for far too long. While Evelyn's speech ignited hope within the community, Jake Miller sat silently in his darkened apartment, shrouded in the isolation of his own actions. The video of his behavior had become one of the most widely shared clips on social media. Thousands of angry comments poured in, some calling him a racist, others demanding severe punishment. Jake hadn't left his apartment in days. He turned off his phone and avoided all media. Yet he couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in his mind. At night, he often dreamed of Evelyn's eyes that weren't angry or vengeful, but deeply disappointed. That disappointment weighed heavily on him, suffocating him. One evening, Jake decided to do something he never thought he would. He searched for the video that had turned his life upside down. For the first time, he watched it not with defensiveness, but with sincerity, as he saw himself shove Evelyn to the ground. A profound wave of regret rose within him. "What have I done?" Jake whispered. For the first time, he saw himself through the eyes of others. His actions no longer felt like doing his duty, but rather an abuse of power, driven by prejudices he had never dared to confront. Jake sat there, his hands clenched tightly, but instead of anger or bitterness, he felt something new, a need to make amends. The question was, where to begin? In a small room at the police department, an internal hearing was held to evaluate Jake's actions and determine his future in the force. Witnesses were summoned, and the video evidence had become an irrefutable centerpiece of the case. Jake sat at the defendant's table, facing a panel that included Thomas Carter and other department leaders. On the other side, members of the community who had witnessed the incident were present to give their testimonies. The first to speak was a young woman who had recorded the video. She recounted in detail everything she had seen, leaving out no aspect of Jake's behavior. After her, several other witnesses spoke, all agreeing that Jake's actions were unacceptable and unjustifiable. Thomas, seated at the head of the panel, maintained a calm but steely demeanor. When it was Jake's turn to speak, the room fell silent, as if holding its collective breath. Jake stood, his voice rough and strained. "I don't deny what I did. I have no excuses. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I see I was wrong. I let my prejudice cloud my judgment, and I regret it deeply." His words left the room stunned. Thomas studied Jake for a long moment before finally speaking. "Do you understand that your actions didn't just harm Mrs. Evelyn but also impacted the entire community? You've undermined the trust we've spent years trying to build." Jake bowed his head. "I know, and I'm ready to take responsibility." The panel convened in private, and a decision was reached. Jake was dismissed from the police force and would face a civil trial. But as Thomas left the room, he knew this was only the first step on a much longer journey toward accountability and change. That evening, Thomas drove to his mother's house. He needed advice not as a police chief, but as a son. Evelyn was sitting in her familiar rocking chair, the warm glow of a small lamp casting a soft light around her. Thomas sat down beside her, saying nothing for a long time. Sensing his silence, Evelyn gently asked, "What's on your mind, Thomas?" Leaning back in his chair, Thomas sighed. "I don't know if I've done enough, Mom. I don't know if I can change this system." Evelyn smiled, her eyes full of patience. Thomas, do you remember when you were little, and I used to tell you that planting just one good seed could change an entire garden? Thomas nodded. He remembered those childhood days when Evelyn would walk him through impoverished neighborhoods, teaching him about compassion and justice. He remembered the stories she shared about fighting against injustice and never giving in to prejudice. You planted a seed today, Thomas, Evelyn said. Don't expect it to grow overnight, but I believe that if you keep tending to your garden, one day, you'll see it bloom. Her words sparked a renewed sense of hope in Thomas. He knew this fight would not be easy, but he also knew he wasn't in it alone. The courtroom was packed on the day Jake Miller stood trial. Public interest in the case had been intense for weeks, and now all eyes were on the former police officer, who was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Though Evelyn chose not to attend the trial, her supporters filled the seats, alongside social activists and journalists from across the country. Jake sat at the defendant's table, looking haggard, his eyes heavy with regret. He was no longer the confident, cold man people had once known. As the prosecutor laid out the charges, the video from that day was replayed for everyone to see. Each frame, each word he had spoken, felt like a knife cutting deeper into Jake's already battered sense of self-worth. The defense attorney argued for leniency, claiming that Jake had acted on reasonable suspicion and had no intention of causing harm. However, the testimonies of witnesses and the overwhelming outcry from the community added significant pressure. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he stood, his voice trembling. Your Honor, I have no intention of making excuses for my actions. What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility. I allowed my prejudice to dictate my behavior, and I cannot change the past. But I promise, from this day forward, I will do everything in my power to make amends. Jake's words did little to ease the anger in the room, but they conveyed a glimmer of sincerity. In the end, the court sentenced him to 1 year of community service, mandatory participation in cultural awareness workshops, and financial restitution to Evelyn. Jake bowed his head silently as he left the courtroom. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey to atone for his mistakes. During his first days of community service, Jake found himself working at a community support center in an area he had once dismissed as a slum. He worked alongside people he had previously looked down upon, individuals he once thought he could never relate to. Jake started with simple tasks, cleaning streets and helping out in the soup kitchen. Initially, he was met with cold shoulders. Most of the people at the center, predominantly people of color, made no effort to hide their discomfort working alongside him. Some avoided him altogether, their eyes filled with disdain. But as time passed, something began to change. Jake started listening to the stories of those around him, accounts of hardship, prejudice, and relentless struggle. He came to realize that the biases he had held weren't just wrong. They were cruel and deeply harmful. One day, Jake met a young social activist named Malik, who had been working at the center for years. Initially distrustful of Jake, Malik gradually noticed a genuine effort in his demeanor. They began to talk, and Malik shared his perspective. You know, Jake, change is never easy, but if you truly want to make amends, you have to do more than just community service. You have to confront your past and commit to doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Malik's words struck a chord with Jake. He began attending cultural awareness workshops, not just because the court required it, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the depth of his mistakes. For the first time, Jake felt like he was becoming a different person, not perfect, but someone who had taken the first steps toward rediscovering himself. While Jake was striving to make amends, Thomas Carter faced an equally monumental challenge. Under intense scrutiny from the public and the city government, he initiated a comprehensive reform plan for the police force. Thomas's plan included mandatory cultural awareness and anti-racism training for all officers. He also proposed a more transparent oversight system, where all cases involving abuse of power would be independently investigated by an external review board. In internal meetings, Thomas encountered fierce resistance from some veteran officers who felt he was breaking tradition and weakening police authority. But Thomas stood firm, rising to address his team. He spoke with unwavering conviction. If our tradition includes turning a blind eye to injustice, then it's a tradition that needs to be broken. We don't just serve the law, we serve the people. And if we can't build trust with the community, we have already failed. Thomas's words began to sway some of the doubters. Younger officers, many of whom had witnessed the fallout from Jake's actions, started rallying behind the reform efforts. A renewed sense of purpose began to spread within the force, though the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. One afternoon, Jake appeared at Evelyn's doorstep. Months had passed since the incident, and Jake felt he needed to face her, not as someone accused, but as a person seeking redemption. Evelyn opened the door, her expression calm as she saw Jake's somber face. She didn't say a word, simply stepping aside to let him in. They sat in the small living room, sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the faces of two people who had both changed profoundly. Jake lowered his head, his voice hoarse. "I'm here to apologize, not just for what I did to you, but for all the prejudices I've carried. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm trying to change." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before replying. "Jake, forgiveness isn't something I can offer right away, but I can see the change in your eyes. That tells me you're heading in the right direction." The encounter ended with a simple but meaningful handshake. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement that hope can exist, even in the darkest of times. As time passed, Jake Miller completed much of his community service and continued attending cultural awareness workshops. Through this process, he began to transform his perspective on himself and the world around him. However, Jake knew that much of the community was still not ready to forgive him. His final hearing, which would determine any additional community service and supervised rehabilitation, was approaching, a milestone marking the last chapter of his legal responsibilities. The courtroom was less crowded this time, though journalists and a few witnesses were present. Jake felt different, no longer the cold, prejudiced officer he had once been. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before the sentence was delivered, Jake stood, gripping the sides of the wooden podium tightly. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I want to say that I am no longer the person people saw in that video. I know I've hurt not just one woman but an entire community. I betrayed the trust of those I was sworn to protect. I don't expect forgiveness to come easily, but I promise to dedicate the rest of my life to doing what's right, no matter how difficult that might be." Jake's words echoed in the silent courtroom. The judge nodded and delivered the sentence. An additional 6 months of community service and mandatory participation in periodic social rehabilitation programs for the next 2 years. Though not severe, the sentence carried profound meaning. Jake would need to prove his transformation through continued actions. As he stepped out of the courthouse, Jake felt a sense of relief. He knew he had begun to pay for his mistakes, but he also understood that his journey had only just begun. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jake was invited to a gathering at the community center where he had once completed his community service. The event was a special occasion, organized to celebrate progress in rebuilding trust between the police force and the local community. Initially hesitant, Jake eventually agreed to attend, encouraged by Malik, the friend he had made during his time at the center. As Jake entered the building, he could feel the weight of every gaze on him. Some people still remembered him as the officer involved in the incident with Evelyn, but instead of turning their backs, they silently observed, waiting to see what he would do. The gathering began with speeches from local leaders. Malik, serving as the event's moderator, unexpectedly invited Jake to the stage to share his story. Jake's heart raced, but he realized this was his opportunity to speak with sincerity. "Hello, everyone," Jake began, his voice trembling slightly. I know many of you remember the mistakes I made. I'm not here to make excuses, but to say that I'm sorry, and I want to thank this community for giving me the chance to change." Jake recounted his journey, from a man burdened by prejudice to someone who had learned, through community service and reflection, to see others with his heart instead of through judgmental eyes. When he finished, a modest applause filled the room, not overwhelming, but enough to let Jake know he had taken another step toward reconciliation. Toward the end of the event, Evelyn appeared. She slowly made her way toward Jake. For the first time since the incident, they faced each other without tension, speaking just loud enough for Jake to hear. Evelyn said softly, "I can see you've changed, Jake. I hope you continue on this path." Jake nodded, feeling as if a heavy knot inside him had finally been untied. At the police department, Thomas Carter was implementing deeper and more comprehensive reforms. He understood that a few initial changes were not enough. To truly rebuild trust with the community, the police force needed to transform from the ground up. Thomas initiated collaborative programs between the police and local residents. Officers were encouraged to participate in community events, volunteer at charity centers, and hold open forums to listen to citizens' concerns. A new task force was established, comprising young, passionate officers eager to learn and drive change. One day, during a press conference, Thomas made a powerful declaration: "We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it." This force is committed to becoming a symbol of justice and trust. No one, whether a citizen or an officer, is above the law. His words were met with approval from the community. Thomas knew the journey ahead was long and challenging, but he could sense a growing light of hope spreading throughout the city. Months later, Jake decided to return to the community center, not as part of his mandated community service, but as an official volunteer. He began teaching skill-building classes for teenagers, sharing his story as a reminder that change is always possible. Evelyn, now a symbol of patience and forgiveness, continued attending community gatherings. She often said, "Each of us can be a seed of change, as long as we are willing to be nurtured by compassion." Thomas remained at the helm of the police department, and his reforms began yielding tangible results. Complaints about misuse of power dropped significantly, and the community's trust in the police force was gradually restored. The story concluded with Jake, Malik, Evelyn, and Thomas attending a vibrant street festival together, where people from the community gathered to share joy. The shadows of the past no longer haunted them, serving instead as a powerful reminder that humans are capable of change and redemption.